Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our last unit, Unit 8 on mythology, anthropology, and society. Today we're going to be talking about how modern society is influenced by myth and what it has to do with the modern discipline of anthropology. We can see here in this slide just one example of how mythology can influence modern society in the form of literature and mass media. Depicted at the top picture here, we have the three-headed dog Fluffy, who guards the Sorcerer's Stone in the movie Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone from 2001, and the book upon which it is based. And on the bottom, we have the three-headed dog Cerberus, the guardian of the underworld, from a black figure vase of the 5th century BCE in ancient Greece. So we can plainly see that J.K. Rowling's inspiration for the three-headed dog Fluffy came directly from Greek mythology. As a matter of fact, in the book, when Harry, Ron, and Hermione ask Hagrid where he got the three-headed dog Fluffy, he says, well, I bought him off some Greek fellow I met down the pub, which of course is a direct reference to Greek mythology and of course indicates that Fluffy is in fact Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld. So there's a lot of these sorts of things that we're going to be discussing today, sort of how mythology relates to the discipline of anthropology and to modern day societies. The first term I want to talk about today is the term Sitzen-Leben. Sitzen-Leben is a German term. The literal translation is situation in life, and it refers to the cultural context into which a myth fits. We've discussed this several times over the course of the semester. We've talked about mythological types, subject matter, origins, and function within mythology, and we've also talked about its context as well. We've talked about, for every paper, there'll be questions such as, what types of creation myth are there in this story? What types of god or goddess are in the story? What types of sacred place are in the story? What aspects of the trickster are in the story? Whereas the other questions I've asked you guys to answer in your papers have been cultural. What does this myth tell us about the culture that it comes from? What does this myth tell us about gender relations within the culture? What does it tell us about the way power and authority works within the culture? What does it tell us about the morals and values within a culture? However, this context cannot be applied universally in culture. All of you know that you yourselves may have grown up in religious families, and in focusing on that mythology, you don't necessarily believe every single thing that your parents believe, do you? Not only that, your parents don't believe everything that their grandparents believe, that their parents believed. Even people of the same age who are raised in the same religious or cultural background are going to have different approaches to these sacred stories. So what we're going to look at now is then how do individuals interpret these? And there's a general scale as to how these are interpreted. This is in general to as mythic literacy, the idea of an understanding or knowledge that an individual has about myth within their culture or religion. And the way people approach myths and mythic literacy can vary greatly. And this variation goes in a range from ethnocentrism, which we've already discussed, all the way through cultural relativism, which we have also discussed. So let's look at each of these in turn. On one end of the side is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, as we discussed in Unit 1, is the approach that your own beliefs are the center of everything and other beliefs are judged in reference to them and according to our own preconceptions. In an ethnocentric world, each group believes itself to be superior, exalts its own beliefs and divinities, and looks with contempt upon those of others. It's not just that I'm right, but it's that I'm right and those who disagree are wrong. And we can see very often that this is also a matter of perspective. This is how we related ethnocentrism to the idea of the popular definition of myth. The popular definition of myth, if you recall, defined myths as outdated or outmoded means of expression. Whereas when you apply the term myth to something, beliefs that people still hold, such as the myths found in Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and other contemporary religions, all of a sudden they consider it insulting. When in fact, the whole perspective of this is a matter of perspective. One step down from centrism is the idea of orthodoxy or literalism. This is as compared to iconography or symbolism. Literalism is the approach that everything depicted in a myth really happened, that sacred texts and myths are meant to be taken literally. For example, for the Babylonians, many Babylonians believed that the story of Gilgamesh was to be taken literally. It wasn't a metaphor or a lesson designed to teach people the inevitability of death. Gilgamesh really did travel down to the underworld in search of immortality and really did meet Shamash and Siduri and Utnapishtim and have the plant stolen away from him by a snake. This sounds, of course, ludicrous to us, but of course we know many people who believe wholeheartedly in the myth of Adam and Eve and the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and believe that this is in fact a literal truth as opposed to a symbolic truth. Other people take a more symbolic approach to mythology, believing that things depicted in a group's myths didn't necessarily actually happen, and that they're not meant to be taken literally, but rather that they act as lessons or metaphors. So going back to the idea of the Epic of Gilgamesh, symbolists would look at Gilgamesh as a metaphor or a lesson designed to teach people how to accept death. And that it was, in fact, when it was written, it was never meant to be taken literally. So there are two different approaches to mythology that we see here. One is literalism, the other symbolism. Here we have one particular author who is talking specifically about Christian mythology and talked about how many of these ancient texts were actually meant to be believed literally, but others are meant to be, were originally written to be taken symbolically. Whereas today, many people take even those stories which were meant to be symbolic and they interpret them in a literal fashion. Quote, "My point once again is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we now are smart enough to take them symbolically, but they told them symbolically and now we are simply dumb enough to take them literally." So we can see this idea, this struggle between literalism and symbolism within mythology is actually very, very present. Next step in mythic literacy is the idea of free substitution. Free substitution is an approach which accepts the ability within myth to replace one member of a category with another without altering the sense of the story. There are elements within myths which can vary greatly, and there can be, as we've discussed before, multiple versions of myths because myths began as oral traditions. For example, in Arthurian legend, in some versions of the Arthurian myth, King Arthur is English. In other, he's French, Welsh, or even Irish. Does his nationality really matter to the story? Of course not. The same could be found in the 12 Labors of Hercules. In some versions, the Nemean lion, defeating the Nemean lion was his first labor. In some versions, the Nemean lion is the offspring of the Titans Typhon and Echidna. In other words, it was born from a beast known as the Chimera, which was a half lion and half scorpion creature. But in essence, these small details simply don't matter to the overall symbolic meaning of the story. Another hallmark of oral tradition is the idea of recombination. This refers to the idea that not just minor parts, but major elements of myths can be broken up, reworked into other myths, often without changing their original meaning. A great example of this is the story of Narcissus from ancient Greek mythology. Narcissus was a man who was so full of himself and so in love with himself that he saw his own reflection in a pond and fell in love with it. Now, it's at this part of the story where we end up with all of these different divergent versions. In some versions, Narcissus turns into a flower. He sits there staring at his reflection so long that he becomes a flower. In others, he commits suicide. He reaches into the pool in an attempt to embrace himself and drowns. In yet others, he falls in love with his twin sister rather than his own reflection. Does it matter to the overall meaning of the myth, which is do not be like Narcissus, do not be narcissistic and in love with yourself? No, that original meaning still remains. The same thing is found in the myth of Oedipus. In some versions, when Oedipus finds out that he's killed his father and married his mother, he plucks out his own eyes. In other versions, he commits suicide or remains unscathed, but the overall meaning remains the same. Now, as we discussed way back in Unit 1, the approach that anthropologists prefer to take with regards to mythology is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the approach that because each group's own beliefs are valid to themselves, they should also be treated valid by others. In other words, there's no universal standard for right or wrong with regards to other people's beliefs. I like to think of it almost like the golden rule. Do you remember the golden rule from kindergarten? Treat others the way you want to be treated. The same thing, except treat others' beliefs the way you would want yours to be treated. In terms of cultural relativists and anthropologists, we try to use cultural relativism to say, well, if we're really going to study this culture, let's study it from the perspective of people within that culture. Let's attempt to look at things from the point of view of the people as opposed to our own point of view. So that's the main sort of focus of cultural relativism. And as I said, the whole idea of mythic literacy runs the gamut from one to the other. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about today is the relationship between myth and family. And this relates back to the Oedipus myth that I was just talking about. But mythology, like other aspects of anthropology, can relate to other aspects of anthropology. One subset of anthropology that anthropologists also often look at is kinship. Kinship is essentially the study of relationships between family members, whether close family members or extended family members within anthropology. All human societies define these categories of marriage or sexual relationships and who's family and who is not, which relations are forbidden, i.e. incest, and which are not. Myths such as those of Oedipus illustrate these taboos. And in studying kinship, we can often see that it relates to mythology because these mythologies show what kind of kinship system these cultures have. Let's look at some examples of this. In modern American society, sexual relationships between any relatives of any kind is strongly prohibited. This is because we have what's called a bilateral kinship system, in which relatives on both the mother's and father's sides are considered equal members of the family. However, other cultures, such as the Dogon of West Africa, who we explored in Unit 2, or the Iroquois, who we explored also in Unit 2, have what's called a unilineal kinship system, in which relatives on either the mother's or father's sides are considered important, and patrilines, or lines of family through the father's line, are considered important, or matrilines, lines through the female side of the family. So let's take a look at some examples of kinship systems. In modern America, we have what's called a bilateral kinship system, which is to say that everybody that I'm related to by blood is considered related to by blood. Let's say that this here is me. I'm using my cursor to illustrate. I have a brother and a sister, I have a father and a mother, and I have a set of grandparents. All of my uncles and aunts and cousins are considered related to me, except those related by marriage, which are in white. That's because these relationships are defined by affinity. That is to say, they're defined by marriage as opposed to shared blood. However, many cultures have a unilineal kinship system, such as the Dogon of West Africa, who we know were patrilineal, or the Iroquois Native American tribes, who we know were matrilineal. In this patrilineal system, let's say that this is me. In this patrilineal system, I would be related to my sister, my father, my grandfather, and my aunts and uncles through my father's line, and my cousins through my uncle's line. However, I would not be considered part of the same family grouping as my mother, my grandmother, or my cousins through my aunt. This is, of course, in a patrilineal system because everything goes through the male line, or patriline. This is expressed in myth among the Dogon culture, because we know the Dogon culture was very, very patriarchal. So of course they also have a patrilineal, unilineal kinship system. In the unilineal kinship system, there are two types of cousins. Cross cousins are those related to one another through parents of the opposite sex, and are not considered part of the same family grouping. So for example, because this is a patrilineal family tree here, or a patrilineal kinship chart, this woman here, my sister, would not be considered related or part of the same family to her male cousin, because of course the male cousin came from the line of an aunt as opposed to an uncle. Whereas I would be considered related to my female cousin on my uncle's side, because of course it went through the male line. So why is this important? Well, it's important because culturally this is expressed in what we call endogamy and exogamy. Groupings of people, whether these groups are familial, cultural, ethnic, or religious, are called moieties. And endogamy is marriage within that moiety, because it keeps power and wealth concentrated inside that grouping. Sometimes these groupings are familial. The Awlad Ali Bedouin, for example, practice parallel cousin marriage very frequently. The Habsburgs, the royal family of Europe, who at one time controlled all of the Holy Roman Empire and all of Spain and Portugal and all of those countries' colonial possessions in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, kept their power and wealth concentrated in their family because they married members of their own family, whether third cousins, first cousins, or even uncles and nieces, as we see in these in red here. Of course, this has disadvantages. By the time they got down to King Charles II of Spain, who lived from 1661 to 1700, he suffered from serious physical and mental disabilities, including impotence or infertility, which led him unable to have a child. However, endogamy is not limited just to marriage inside of a family group. It can also be cultural, ethnic, or religious. A Catholic family, Catholic mother and father may want their son to marry a nice Catholic girl, for example. Another example, my father-in-law is French-Canadian. My mother-in-law, before she passed away, was Portuguese. When my father-in-law first started dating my mother-in-law, her parents would do everything they could to keep her from dating this man. Not because he wasn't nice and lovely, because he was, but rather simply because he was from a French-Canadian family and they wanted her to marry a nice Portuguese boy. So we have this practice of endogamy happening throughout many world cultures, and this is also often expressed through myth and folklore. We also have examples of some families that favor exogamy, which is marriage outside of a moiety, because it promotes the exchange of ideas, power, and wealth. Now, family isn't the only way that mythology is related to modern society. We also see it in literature. This includes texts, artworks, performance, film, TV, video games, advertising, you name it. There are three distinct categories of how mythology is used in literature. These include mythography, mythopoeia, or the artificial mythology, and allusion. Now, mythography is the compiling or the retelling of an existing myth in any format. So this includes the study of myth in books such as Mythography, the Study of Myths and Rituals by William Doty, Joseph Campbell's work on A Hero with a Thousand Faces and the Power of Myth, or the expression of mythology in multiple ways, whether through poetry, as in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, through artwork, such as this Greek vase depicting the myth of the killing of Niobe's children by the gods Apollo and Artemis, through plays such as Oedipus Rex, or through modern-day movies, which, while they may not necessarily be accurate to the content of the myth, still are a retelling of the myth in some way. Something that's similar to mythography, but different in its own way, is mythopoeia. Mythopoeia is the creation of an artificial mythology. This is taking some of the basic structures of mythology, such as gods, goddesses, heroes, mystagogues, tricksters, and various other elements found within myth, and applying them to your own sort of artificially created story. This was done by J.R.R. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, by H.P. Lovecraft and his Cthulhu mythos, by C.S. Lewis and his Narnia Chronicles, by George Lucas in the creation of the Star Wars universe, Gene Roddenberry in the creation of the Star Trek universe, the creation of the DC and Marvel comic universes. The list goes on and on and on and on. And then finally we also have allusion, which is references to mythology in movies, TV, literature, video games, or really any other aspect of everyday life. For example, the play My Fair Lady was based on an earlier play that was based on the story of the Greek myth of Pygmalion and Galatea. Hermes, the messenger god, is used as advertising for FTD florists. We call the tendon that connects your ankle to your calf the Achilles tendon because of the story of how Achilles was only vulnerable in his heel. Many people think that the car company Mazda is actually named after the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda. We already talked about the role of Fluffy, the three-headed dog that guards the entrance to where the Sorcerer's Stone is kept in Harry Potter. And we can also talk about how the months of the year and the days of the week are named after various gods from Roman and Viking mythology. January is named after Janus, the two-headed Roman god of beginnings. March is named after Mars, the Roman god of war. Juno is named after, June is named after Juno, who they also call Hera, the queen of the gods. July and August are named after the deified Roman emperors Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. And the days of the week are named after Norse gods, such as Tuesday, or Tirsdag, the day of the god of justice and bravery, Tyr. Woden's-dag, or Wednesday, named after Woden or Odin, the king of the gods in Norse mythology. And Thursday, which very obviously is Thor's day. So you can see that various aspects of our everyday lives are tied up directly with mythology. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with relation to myth in modern society is how it relates to our everyday lives as people, as members of countries, as members of civilizations. The fact that myth is everywhere, you see it in family, in literature, in all society, this speaks to what Carl Jung called a universal grammar, a series of underlying principles which exist below the level of consciousness in all cultures. There are plenty of examples of this. Myth is also important in modern society from a socio-political perspective. Some myths referred to as national myths are myths about a nation's past, which help create a unified national identity. Stories such as George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Many of our modern conceptions of history, of American history, are in fact themselves myths. The Declaration of Independence was not signed on July 4th. It was not like a John Trumbull painting where everybody got together in the same day and signed the Declaration of Independence. It was signed across multiple days and by many people who were essentially like bullied or forced into signing it. It was not a universal thing at all. There are also myths about national heroes, city founders, or culture givers, such as those surrounding America's founding fathers, which I've talked about. Aeneas in Roman mythology, who was supposedly founded Italian civilization, Finn McCool in Irish mythology, etc. We call myths that are focused around the founding of a city, state, or civilization founding myths, and those which focus around a particular ethnic group, mythomoteurs, or French for myth engine. Now, these types of myths help generate a sense of nationalism among the population. Nationalism involves strong identification of a group of individuals with a political entity defined in national terms, i.e. a nation, state, or ethnicity. This creates a sense of collective identity, a people who are autonomous, united, and express a single national culture. National flags, national anthems, and other symbols of national identity are often considered sacred, as if they were religious rather than political symbols. For example, how do many people feel about the burning of the American flag? What is the symbolism behind that? Why is that treated as a symbol which is just as sacred as, say, a religious symbol? Unfortunately, the opposite side to this is, of course, it can lead to the violation of the basic human rights of those who do not share the same national identity. For example, fascism as a form of government is an extreme form of nationalism. And all of these various myths that I've just talked about help create this sense of nationalism. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about today is the idea of the urban legend. Simply put, an urban legend, also called an urban myth, urban tale, or contemporary legend, is a form of modern folklore consisting of stories that are usually believed by their tellers to be true. They're passed down in oral tradition, the same as myths were. They're circulated as the same as myths. There are multiple versions of them, the same as myths. Despite their names, urban legends are not necessarily from an urban area, but rather the terms used to differentiate legend from traditional folklore to that from modern times. And we find examples of urban legends from all across the world. Whether stories about people's kidneys being stolen, the story of the Kentucky Fried Rat from an American culture, stories of mythical creatures such as Bigfoot, the Chupacabra, alligators in the sewers of New York City. Conspiracy theories very often can be referred to as urban legends because they are circulated in the same manner as an oral tradition. And modern day urban legends and stories, the idea, for example, the idea that Mr. Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was actually a former Army sniper is a complete fabrication. That is an urban legend. That's something that was created out of whole cloth collectively by a series of people. The modern day urban legend of the Slender Man, for example, is another example of that sort of urban legend. So this is where we're going to end things for today. As I mentioned before, there is no necessity to turn in a paper for Unit 8. However, if you wish to turn in a paper for Unit 8 for extra credit, you may feel free to do so. To complete this paper, what you have to do is take what you've learned from Unit 8 and from your time in class and try creating your own myth, right, with its own gods, goddesses, heroes, tricksters, etc. You can turn this in via email or upload it onto Blackboard at any time. And you can additionally email it to me. You can email it to me as well, so that's also a possibility. So this is actually where we're pretty much going to end things for Unit 8. I'll also be posting a video lecture for review for the final, which is going to have a slightly different format than the midterm and will be broken up into smaller parts than the midterm to make it easier to accomplish. As before, there's also going to be a discussion board or message board for Unit 8 for anyone who has any questions about it. And hopefully I will be posting information about the final exams soon. Thank you very much, and I hope that you had a wonderful semester.